Chapter 26, Lord Latimer's Ladies, by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin. Read by Dan McLaughlin. Chapter 26, Everyone Plays a Game. In the wake of Alice's departure, the room was quiet. Brian looked at the assembled company and wondered whether they were distracted by his illness or actually pondering the difficulties inherent in communicating with a house that could only speak in binary. Their most experienced translator had gone off on a quest, and they were left with an oracle who could only say yes or no, with a maybe and an earthquake thrown in for emphasis. Brian said, "I guess we could teach him Morse code." Eagerly grasping at anything that sounded like a solution, Iris quickly asked, "What is that, my dearest?" "Oh, it hasn't been invented yet," he said, a statement that at this point scarcely raised an eyebrow from the assembled ladies. But in Morse, each letter of the alphabet is a series of audio dots and dashes. Brian hit out the familiar to him shave and a haircut 2 bits. In Morse code, that means end of transmission. Everyone was looking at him with the usual mixture of bewilderment and good-natured befuddlement. "It means I'm done." The women stopped staring at him to exchange speaking looks, and Brian hastened to explain. "Trust me, I got a Scots Merit Badge." That didn't seem to help as much as Brian assumed it would. Lenora continued to focus on what she clearly saw as the main point. "I don't understand how useful it will be to teach Carl how to tell us when he has nothing more to say," she said dubiously. "That doesn't sound like much of an improvement." "But don't you see," said Eliza with growing excitement, "that's just the basis for the language. With time, we could make expressions in rhythm for all kinds of things. We could use Brian's Morse alphabet." "Oh, goody, a house taught to babble like Brian," murmured Lenora, not quite under her breath. "And with enough time, Carl can share all his ideas. He can spell them out," finished Eliza. "Unfortunately, I don't remember much of Morse code, and even if I could remember it, Carl would need more time to learn to spell than we have," said Brian. Carl banged a shutter once in emphatic agreement and then did a shave and a haircut. Brian laughed. "Carl says yes, and That's all he has to say. Carl billowed the curtains complacently, and the ladies and Brian laughed. Eliza said, I am beginning to suspect that Carl has a droll sense of humor. Lenora said, if only he isn't making a game of us. Suddenly, Iris gave a little gasp of surprise. She sat bolt upright and said, oh my, this sounds like the game of 20. Sounds like what now? Asked Brian. Oh, it's all the rage in London, Iris assured him, then turned to address them all. It is a game wherein one player thinks of an item and all the others must guess it by asking questions that can only be answered yes, no, or maybe. I don't know why we didn't think of it earlier. Perhaps a game of 20 will provide the answer. Brian was willing to cede the floor to Iris, but he couldn't help but to put in his 2 cents. In our time, we have a similar game called 20 Questions, and it starts with the person who comes up with the thing having to say whether it's animal, vegetable, or mineral, he noted. Precisely so, said Iris. Her knowledge of the latest trends in the highest of society and her willingness to explain them at great length was for once proving to be useful. Naturally, animal can encompass any person, famous or fictional, as well as any of the lesser beasts. Vegetable would include any matter that can be grown or made of something that is grown. Mineral is anything drawn from the ground or made of such things. Carl, have you been listening? Carl gave a polite bang of assent. Excellent. I shall go first, and you shall all see how it plays. Brian looked around for a piece of paper to keep track of the questions, but he found none. Animal, said Iris. Is it bigger than a bread box? Asked Brian promptly. The ladies looked at him in evident confusion. The idea is to start big, then narrow it down, Brian explained. Yes, said Iris. Is it a cow? Asked Lenora. No, said Brian. That's not the way the game works. We only have 20 questions, so we can't just start guessing names of animals at random. We have to narrow down what kind of animal it is by category. Like, does the animal fly? Is that your question? Clarified Iris. Yes. Does this animal fly? Brian said formally. No. 2. See, said Brian, like that. I think I understand, said Eliza. her face narrowing in concentration on both the mechanics of the game as well as its strategy. So, like a fish, does this animal live in the water? Good, said Brian. That's the way to do it. No, 3. But a good try, he added. Now we don't have to ask about all the kinds of fish and whales and octopuses and... Is this animal a sheep? Interrupted Lenora. No, said Brian with a sigh. Lenora, if you think it might be a sheep, you have to ask if it is a domesticated animal first. Then, if it is an animal that lives in England, then you can guess sheep. He took a breath, but then, before he could continue his tutorial, Iris, who had been listening to Brian with a growing grin, interrupted. No, sheep is what she said, so sheep is her guess, said Iris. And the answer is yes, it is a sheep indeed. The room erupted in laughter, and both Eliza and Iris offered hearty congratulations to Lenora. The house banged the shutters 4 times and billowed all the curtains, joining in the general merriment. Beginner's luck, muttered Brian. I knew that you were interested in sheep, Lenora, and so sheep just sort of popped into my head, Iris explained. Now, just to be clear, Eliza said, animal would have been the proper category if the object to be guessed had been a blanket made of wool. Brian and Iris looked at each other and nodded. Yes, said Iris. A slight rumble rolled through the castle. I think Carl should go next, said Iris, and a shutter banged once, eagerly insofar as one could tell. Pray, tell us, Carl, animal, vegetable, or mineral? A shutter distinctly banged twice. Vegetable, said Iris. Is it bigger than a bread box? Asked Eliza, looking at Brian for validation. Is it clover? Said Lenora, eagerly and almost at the same moment, in obvious hope that lightning would strike twice. Carl banged his shutters several times. Ladies, one question at a time, said Iris. The game requires that each question be distinct. Eliza looked to Lenora and made a small gesture for the other lady to go first. Is it clover? Repeated Lenora, as Brian hid his face and groaned in mock despair. 2 knocks. No, Iris had evidently appointed herself both interpreter and scorekeeper. 1. Is it bigger than a bread box? Asked Eliza. Brian nodded approvingly. There was a slight pause, as if Carl was thinking of a bread box, several of which he had inside him, and compared it to his object. He banged a shutter once. "Yes, 2. Is it an oak tree?" asked Lenora. Carl replied with 2 distinct bangs. "No," said Iris primly. 3. Brian shook his head and said, "Is this item made of vegetable material, or is it a plant itself?" Iris shook her head in patent disapproval. "One question at a time that can be answered yes or no, Brian. You know better." Embarrassed to have made a procedural mistake, especially after taking it upon himself to tutor others, Brian went with, "Is this item the actual plant?" The shutter banged twice. "No." 4. Without thinking, Brian continued to speak. "So that means it's something made of plant." "No, wait." The shutter banged once. "Yes." 5. "I didn't mean that as a question. It shouldn't count." Carl answered it. "So it counts," ruled Iris. Eliza, thinking furiously, ventured, "Carl, is this item grown on your lands?" "Oh, good question," said Brian. "Clover grows here," muttered Lenora, mostly under her breath. The shutter banged twice. "No, 6. So that means," began Brian. "Cotton," shouted Eliza. "Curtains," exclaimed Lenora. The shutter banged once and then rapped out, "Shave and a haircut." "Yes," said Iris approvingly. "Well done, Carl." The curtains billowed with pride. Everyone fell to discussing how clever Carl and his selection was, and how clever their own questions had been. It took a surprising amount of time before Brian was brought to understand the full measure of the castle's grand windows, enough to concede that a curtain once folded up was too big to fit in a bread box. As the discussion continued and the game continued, Brian wondered what was keeping Alice and if she was having fun. End of chapter 26. Lord Latimer's Ladies by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin. Read by Dan McLaughlin.